Let me talk to you like you're sitting right next to me for a second. There's a moment that doesn't get talked about enough. It's quiet. No arguments. No dramatic goodbye. Just a slow realization that you're always the one adjusting, waiting, explaining, softening yourself, while the other person stays just out of reach. And at some point, something inside you tightens. Not anger, not desperation, just clarity. You start asking yourself a question that's uncomfortable to admit. Why am I the only one trying this hard? Here's the controversial part most men don't want to hear. The problem usually isn't that the avoidant doesn't care. It's that you've unknowingly trained them not to show up. Not because you're weak, but because you're accommodating, patient, and hoping things will naturally balance out. They don't. They tilt further. And no one warns you about this. Avoidants don't respond to pressure, chasing, or emotional speeches. They respond to structure. They respond to clarity. And most importantly, they respond when access to you stops being unlimited. This video isn't about tricks. It's not about playing hard to get, ignoring texts, or pretending you don't care. That stuff backfires. What we're talking about here is something much more grounded. Boundaries that quietly force a decision. Boundaries that don't punish, threaten, or demand, but simply reveal the truth. Because when you set the right boundary, something very specific happens. The avoidant either feels the weight of losing access to you and steps forward, or they quietly remove themselves. And both outcomes are wins, even if one of them doesn't feel good at first. What most men miss is that boundaries aren't ultimatums. They're not emotional walls. They're information. They tell the other person how to treat you, what access looks like, and what no longer works. In this video, I'm going to walk you through 5 boundaries that do something powerful. They don't argue. They don't beg. They don't explain endlessly. They create a moment of truth where the avoidant has to choose. Step up or step out. And once you understand this, you'll never confuse patience with self-betrayal again. Let's start with something you felt, but maybe never said out loud. There's a constant low-level tension when you're an avoidant. Not because of what they do, but because of what they don't do. You're left guessing. Guessing where you stand. Guessing if today is a good day to talk. Guessing whether silence means peace or distance. And over time, that guessing drains you more than any argument ever could. Here's the uncomfortable truth most men miss. Emotional guessing is not a communication problem. It's a boundary problem. When you allow ambiguity to exist indefinitely, you teach the other person that clarity is optional. Avoidants don't usually intend to confuse you. They simply operate in a space where emotional vagueness feels safe to them. And if you keep adapting to that space, they never have a reason come out of it. This first boundary is simple, but it's powerful. You stop participating in unclear emotional dynamics, not through confrontation, not through emotional speeches, but through consistency in what you accept and what you don't. This looks like no longer responding to mixed signals with effort, no longer filling silence with reassurance, no longer over-investing when the connection feels undefined. You don't announce this boundary, you embody it. What happens next is subtle but important. The avoidant starts to feel something unfamiliar. Responsibility. Not pressure, responsibility. When they realize they can't rely on you to emotionally carry the connection anymore, the dynamic shifts. Suddenly, their actions matter more. Their absences weight. Their silence is no longer neutral. This is where many men sabotage themselves. They break the boundary internally. They feel the discomfort and rush back to restore balance. But the point of this boundary isn't punishment, it's truth. It reveals whether the avoidant is capable of meeting you halfway when emotional fog is removed. And here's the part most people don't expect. If the avoidant does care, this boundary creates safety. Clarity removes pressure. When they understand what access to you requires, they either rise to it or quietly step back. Either way, the guessing stops. And when guessing stops, so does the anxiety. This boundary doesn't force closeness. It forces honesty. And once honesty enters a dynamic, everything else becomes clearer, including whether this connection has a future worth your time. In the next section, we're going to talk about something even more uncomfortable for most men. Why unlimited access to you actually makes avoidance feel less secure, not more. There's a moment most men remember, even if they don't realize its importance at the time. It's when you're always available, always reachable, always open. And instead of the connection deepening, something quietly fades. The avoidant doesn't lean in, they lean back. Not dramatically, just enough for you to feel the distance. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Access without structure doesn't create closeness. It removes value. Avoidants aren't repelled by care. They're overwhelmed by emotional availability that has no edges. When you offer unlimited access to your time, attention, and emotional energy, you unintentionally remove the need for intentional engagement. There's no urgency, no choice, no moment where they have to decide to step forward. This isn't about playing hard to get. It's about understanding how nervous systems respond to boundaries. Structure creates safety. And when there's no structure, avoidants default to withdrawal because they feel a loss of control, even if you're doing nothing wrong. Most men think consistency means staying available no matter what. But real consistency is actually predictability with limits. It's showing up when there's mutual effort and stepping back when there isn't, calmly, without resentment. When you don't limit access, you teach the avoidant that connection is guaranteed. And when connection feels guaranteed, it stops feeling chosen. That's when respect erodes. Not because you're too much, but because nothing is required. This boundary is about reclaiming your time and presence as something that's shared, not given away. You don't disappear. You don't punish. You simply stop organizing your life around someone who hasn't shown they can meet you with intention. The shift this creates is powerful. The avoidant begins to notice gaps, not dramatic gaps, quiet ones, moments where you're not immediately there, where your energy isn't automatically accessible. And in those moments, they're forced to feel something they usually avoid, their own level of investment. Some avoidants respond by stepping up. They initiate, they clarify, they engage more deliberately. Others fade, not because you push them away, but because the connection required effort they weren't willing to give. And this is where men need to hear the truth. If someone only feels comfortable when you're endlessly available, they don't want connection. They want comfort without responsibility. Unlimited access keeps you emotionally busy, but relationally stagnant. Boundaries create movement, and movement reveals intent. In the next section, we're going to step inside the internal experience most men have when they start setting boundaries. The quiet guilt, the second guessing, and the fear of losing someone by finally choosing themselves. The moment you stop overgiving, something strange happens inside you. It's not relief first. It's discomfort, a quiet tension that sits in your chest and asks, am I doing the wrong thing? You're not angry. You're not cold. You're just not chasing anymore. And that feels unfamiliar. Most men are never taught how much of their self-worth is tied to being needed. So when you stop over-explaining, stop fixing emotional distance, stop compensating for someone else's withdrawal, your nervous system reacts like you've broken an unspoken rule. There's a subtle guilt that creeps in, not because you're hurting anyone, but because you're no longer rescuing the connection. You start noticing how often you used to adjust yourself just to keep things smooth, how often you ignored your own frustration because this is just how they are. You may catch yourself waiting, not for a message, but for clarity. And when it doesn't come, the urge to step back in and restore balance becomes strong. This is the moment where growth feels lonely, because choosing self-respect means tolerating uncertainty without rushing to relieve it. There's also fear. The fear that if you don't keep things alive, they'll die. That if you don't hold emotional weight, the connection will collapse. And that fear can feel personal, like proof that you weren't enough on your own. But what's really happening is this. You're discovering how much effort you were carrying alone. When you stop overgiving, you start seeing imbalance clearly. You realize how much emotional labor you've been providing just to keep things from falling apart. And seeing that truth can feel destabilizing, because it forces you to question whether the connection was mutual or simply maintained by your effort. There's a quiet strength that begins to form here, even if it doesn't feel like confidence yet. It's the strength of not filling every silence, of letting space exist without panic, of allowing someone else to reveal who they are when you stop smoothing the edges. This internal conflict is not weakness. It's recalibration. Your system is learning a new rule. Connection shouldn't cost you your peace. And as uncomfortable as this phase is, it's necessary. Because until you can sit with this tension without betraying yourself, boundaries will always feel like punishment instead of protection. In the next section, we're going to talk about the mistake men often make right here, the one that turns boundaries into ultimatums, and the one adjustment that changes everything. Let's be honest, this is where a lot of men get it wrong. They say they're setting boundaries, but internally, they're still waiting, still hoping, still watching for a reaction. And that hidden expectation quietly undermines everything they're trying to do. Here's the calm but uncomfortable truth. A boundary that exists to change someone else is not a boundary. It's a strategy. And avoidance can feel that difference immediately. When you set limits but remain emotionally invested in how they respond, you haven't actually stepped into self-respect yet. You've just changed tactics. You're still orienting your choices around whether they step up, pull back, or chase. And that keeps you stuck in the same cycle, just with more silence. This is where men need a wake-up moment. Boundaries are not leverage. They're not tests. They're not quiet ultimatums. A real boundary is something you're willing to hold even if nothing changes. And if you're honest, that's where the fear comes in. Because holding a boundary without attachment means accepting that some people will walk away. Many men delay this step because it feels like failure. Like giving up, like admitting you cared more. But in reality, it's the first moment you stop negotiating your worth. Here's the advice you need to hear clearly. Set boundaries to protect your energy, not to provoke a response. The moment your boundary is about getting someone to finally choose you, you've already handed your power back. This doesn't mean becoming detached or cold. It means becoming grounded. You show up clean. You speak plainly. And then you let the outcome reveal the truth without chasing it, fixing it, or explaining it away. When a man finally does this, something shifts. Not always in the relationship, but in him, he stops tying his value to whether someone can meet him emotionally. He stops calling self-abandonment patience. And that's the quiet confidence avoidants respond to. Not because it pressures them, but because it doesn't need them to change to stand firm. In the final section, we're going to talk about what happens next when you hold these boundaries consistently, and the avoidant is forced to either grow into connection or step out of it entirely. There's a moment that comes when you stop adjusting, stop explaining, and stop reopening doors you already closed. It's quiet, almost anticlimactic, and that's exactly why it's powerful. When you hold your boundaries without anger or performance, the relationship enters a new phase. Not because you did something dramatic, but because you finally became consistent with yourself. And consistency is what removes confusion. At this stage, the avoidant has no distractions left. Your availability is no longer unlimited. Your presence is no longer guaranteed. And yet, you're not punishing or withdrawing. You're simply steady, calm, unmoved. This forces a decision. Some avoidants begin to step forward. Not in grand gestures, but in small, deliberate ways. They check in. They clarify intentions. They tolerate more closeness than before. Not because they're chasing, but because the emotional environment now has structure. And structure is what allows them to engage without feeling overwhelmed. Others don't step forward at all. They drift. They go quiet. And this is where most men feel the final wave of doubt. The urge to reach out. To soften the boundary just a little, to reassure, to say what's slipping away. But this is the last test, and it's not for them, it's for you. Holding the line here doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care enough about yourself to stop chasing a dynamic that only survives when you abandon your needs. It means accepting that clarity is more valuable than connection that keeps you anxious. When you do this, something deeper settles in. You stop scanning for signals. You stop interpreting silence. You stop trying to manage someone else's comfort. And in that stillness, you reclaim your emotional authority. The real outcome isn't whether the avoidance stays or leaves. The real outcome is that you no longer lose yourself either way. And that's the point most men miss. Boundaries aren't about control. They're about alignment. When you live in alignment long enough, The people who can meet you stay, and the ones who can't remove themselves without chaos. That's not loss. That's resolution. And once you experience that level of clarity, you'll never confuse intensity with intimacy again. Here's the controversial part, and I want you to sit with it for a second. If setting healthy boundaries causes someone to disappear, you didn't lose them, you stopped carrying them. That's not bitterness. That's reality. Most men are taught to believe that patience, understanding, and emotional endurance will eventually be rewarded. But in avoidant dynamics, overaccommodation doesn't build closeness. It delays the truth. And the truth is this: the right connection doesn't require you to shrink, wait, or overfunction just to keep it alive. When you finally stop chasing clarity and start living it, something important happens. You stop needing validation from someone who couldn't meet you where you stood. You stop confusing effort with love. And you start choosing relationships that don't cost you your self-respect. If this video hit close to home, I want you to comment your experience, not the story, just the moment you realize you were doing more than your share. I read those comments, and I do reach out, because no man figures this out alone. Whether the avoidant steps up or steps out, the outcome is the same when you hold your ground. You move forward intact. And once you experience a connection that meets you without negotiation, you'll never settle for one that only survives on your sacrifice again.